The dust of Redemption Gulch didn't just settle. It suffocated. It was a fine red powder that clung to everything, the cracked leather of worn-out boots, the sweat-slicked necks of horses, and the hope in a woman's soul. For Alara, it tasted of iron and despair. Her tongue was thick with it, her lips cracked like sun-baked earth. The world swam in a haze of heat, the warped, clapboard buildings of the town shimmering like a cruel mirage. Inside her, the tiny, insistent flutter of life was the only thing that felt real, a secret promise in a world of broken vows. Her husband, Thomas, had been a man full of promises, his eyes reflecting the vast, empty sky he'd sworn they would one day own. He'd left her with nothing but his name, a mountain of debt to the general store, and the child growing in her womb, a child the town saw not as a blessing, but as another mouth to feed, another burden on their brittle charity. She had been standing outside Gable's Mercantile for what felt like an eternity, the sun a merciless hammer against her skull. Her black mourning dress, a testament to a grief no one here acknowledged, soaked up the heat until her skin felt cooked. Inside, she could hear the murmur of voices, the clink of coin sounds from a world she no longer belonged to. She had tried to ask for credit, just a bag of flour, a slab of salt pork. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was as starched and unforgiving as her collar, had looked down her long, thin nose. Thomas's debts are still on the ledger, Alara. The church can't be expected to carry the weight of a fool's folly forever. The words were spoken loudly, for the benefit of the other customers, a public shaming. Alara had simply nodded, her dignity a thin, fraying thread, and turned to leave. Now the world began to tilt. The red dust swirled into a vortex, the sharp corners of the buildings softening into a blur. The whispers of the townsfolk on the boardwalk. Look at her, swollen with another mistake, shameless. That one faded into a dull roar, like the sound of the ocean she had never seen. A sharp, cramping pain seized her belly, a terrifying clench that stole her breath. Her hand flew to the swell of her stomach, a primal protective gesture. The baby. Oh God, the baby. Her vision tunneled. The last thing she saw was the splintered wood of the boardwalk rushing up to meet her. The last thing she felt was the rough, gritty kiss of the dust against her cheek. She didn't hear the gasp that rippled through the onlookers. She didn't feel the shadow that fell over her, a sudden blessed eclipse in the brutal sun. She was gone, lost in a black, silent sea. Then, a presence, a stillness in the chaos. Boots, scarred and coated in the dust of a long road, planted themselves beside her head. They were not the polished, self-important boots of Sheriff Thorne, nor the scuffed, shuffling shoes of the townsman. These were the boots of a man who walked his own path. A quiet settled over the street, the whispers dying in throats. A hand, large and calloused, gently brushed the hair from her face. Another slid beneath her shoulders, a third under her knees, lifting her from the dirt with a strength that was steady and sure, not rough. The world smelled of leather, sweat, and something else, pine, maybe, and distant rain. As she was lifted, her head lolled back, her eyes fluttering open for a brief, disoriented moment. She saw a face etched with lines that spoke of sun and sorrow, a square jaw covered in dark stubble, and eyes the color of a stormy sky, filled with a loneliness so profound it mirrored her own. Sheriff Thorne finally pushed his way through the crowd, his belly preceding him, his badge glinting with smug authority. Here now, what's all this? Put her down, stranger. The town will see to her. His voice was oily with false concern. He meant the workhouse, a place of slow starvation and broken spirits, where her child would be born a ward of the county, a piece of property. The stranger didn't look at the sheriff. His gaze was fixed on Alara's pale face, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It carried over the hushed street, A definitive, world-altering statement. "No," he said, the single word a wall of granite. He adjusted his hold on her, pulling her closer to his chest. He looked at Thorne then, his stormy eyes holding the sheriff's gaze, until the man flinched. "I'll take her." It was not a request, it was a claim. A deed of ownership spoken over an unconscious woman in the middle of a dusty street. The town gasped. Mrs. Gable clutched her pearls. Sheriff Thorne's face turned a blotchy red. But no one moved. The stranger, with the pregnant widow in his arms, turned and walked away from the heart of the town, his footsteps sure and steady, leaving behind a cloud of red dust and stunned silence. He walked toward a lone horse and a wagon at the edge of town, a man who had just claimed a life, a future, and a world of trouble, his face a mask of grim determination. He was walking into a storm, and he was carrying its heart in his arms. Her return to consciousness was slow, a painful climb from a deep, dark well. The first thing she registered was movement, a rhythmic, swaying jostle that matched the clop-clop of horse hooves. The second was softness. She was lying on something. Soft burlap sacks, it smelled like, but they were a world away from the hard-packed dirt of the street. She was in the back of a wagon. A rough blanket was tucked around her, its wool scratching her chin. She pushed herself up on trembling elbows, her head pounding. The world outside the wagon was a rolling vista of sagebrush and distant purple. Mountains under a sky so vast it hurt to look at. The sun was lower now, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood. The man sat on the driver's bench, his back to her. A broad, solid back in a dusty chambray shirt. He didn't seem to know she was awake. He just drove, his hands holding the reins with a practiced ease. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through her daze. Who was this man? Where was he taking her? The whispers of the town returned tales of bandits, of men who preyed on lone women. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, the small life within her a source of both fierce courage and paralyzing fear. She had to escape, but where would she run? Out here, in this endless, empty land, he was her only link to survival. As if, sensing her panic, he spoke without turning. "There's water in the canteen next to you, and some jerky." His voice was the same low rumble she vaguely remembered. It held no menace, only a flat, weary sort of command. She saw the canteen. An old dented thing, and beside it, a piece of dried meat wrapped in cloth. Her throat was a dessert. She drank greedily, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. She couldn't bring herself to eat the jerky. It felt too much like acceptance. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her own voice a fragile croak. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the creak of the wagon wheels and the wind whispering through the sage. "My place," he said finally. "Why?" The word was a breath, heavy with 100 unasked questions. "Why did you pick me up? What do you want from me? Are you a good man or a monster?" He turned his head slightly, his profile stark against the setting sun. The grief she had glimpsed in his eyes was still there, a permanent shadow. "The sheriff was going to send you to the workhouse. No child should be born there. That was all." He turned back to the horses, the conversation over. It wasn't an act of kindness, his tone suggested, but a simple statement of fact, a moral line he refused to cross. He had not saved her. He had simply intervened in an injustice. The distinction was both terrifying and, in a strange way, comforting. He didn't want her gratitude. He didn't seem to want anything at all. The journey stretched into the twilight hours. The air grew cold, and she pulled the scratchy blanket tighter. Finally, the wagon slowed. Ahead, nestled in a small windswept valley, was a ranch, or what was left of one. A single cabin stood beside a sturdy-looking barn, but one side of the cabin was blackened with soot, the roof patched with raw, new-looking timber. A corral stood empty, its fence in good repair. But the place was steeped in a profound and aching silence. There were no chickens scratching in the yard, no dog barking. A welcome, no smoke curling from the chimney. It was a place where life had once been, and then, suddenly, was not. It was a home haunted by ghosts. He pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down, his movements stiff. "This is it," he said, his voice softer now, almost lost in the wind. He came around and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since he picked her up. His stormy eyes took in her swollen belly, her pale face, her ragged mourning dress. She saw a flicker of doubt in his gaze, the weight of his impulsive act seeming to land on him all at once. She clutched the side of the wagon, preparing to climb down to prove she was not entirely helpless. "Wait," he said. Before she could protest, he lifted her out of the wagon as easily as he had lifted her from the street, his hands careful not to jar her. He set her on her feet, but kept a steadying hand on her arm as she swayed. The ground felt unsteady beneath. "My name is Caleb," he said, as if just remembering the courtesy. "Ilara," she whispered. He nodded, then led her toward the cabin. The door groaned on its hinges, opening into a single large room thick with the smell of old smoke and disuse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and black. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was tucked into one corner, but on the other side of the room, near the soot-stained wall, was a small rocking chair and a wooden cradle. Both were covered in a fine layer of ash. Caleb's eyes slid toward them, and for a second, his carefully constructed mask of indifference cracked, revealing a chasm of pain so raw it was like a physical wound. He quickly looked away, his jaw tight. He gestured to the bed. You can have the bed. I'll take the floor." He moved toward the fireplace, his movements jerky and unnatural. "It gets cold. I'll start a fire." The cabin was a physical manifestation of his soul, functional, scarred, and haunted by the ghosts of a family that was no longer there. Ilara stood in the middle of the floor, a stranger in a stranger's grief, her own sorrow feeling small and insignificant in the face of such devastation. He had not brought her to a sanctuary. He had brought her to a tomb. And as he knelt to strike a flint, the first spark illuminating the stark lines of his face, she understood. This was not a rescue. It was a collision of 2 broken worlds, 2 lost souls adrift in the same unforgiving wilderness. There would be no easy comfort here. Survival was a fight, and they were both armed with nothing but their wounds. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the unspoken histories of love and loss, a heavy, suffocating blanket that was either going to bind them together or smother them both. The first days were a careful, silent dance around the edges of each other's pain. Caleb was a man of routine. He rose before dawn, his movements quiet but deliberate, and tended to the ranch. He mended the fences the wind had battered, checked on his few cattle grazing in the high pasture, and worked the small patch of land behind the barn, tilling the soil with a grim determination. He rarely spoke. His communication came in the form of actions: a bucket of fresh water left by the door, a stack of firewood replenished before she even noticed it was low, a plate of bland but filling beans and bacon left on the table for her. He ate his own meals standing by the fire, his back to her, as if he couldn't bear to share the intimacy of a table. Ilara, in turn, fought to claim a space for herself in the suffocating stillness of the cabin. Her body was heavy, her movements slow, but her spirit refused to be idle. She found a broom and swept away the layers of dust and ash, the rhythmic scrape of bristles on wood the only sound in the house for hours. She scrubbed the soot from the walls until her knuckles were raw and red, her own quiet war against the ghosts that lingered there. She found a small, neglected vegetable patch near the cabin, and with a rusted trowel she discovered in the barn, began to pull the weeds, her hands sinking into the cool, damp earth. It was grounding, this simple act of nurturing life. She was planting for her baby, for a future, even in this barren place. One afternoon, Caleb returned from the barn to find her on her knees by the soot-stained cradle, a wet rag in her hand, carefully wiping the ash from the carved wood. He froze in the doorway, his face a thundercloud of anguish. "Don't," he choked out, the word torn from him. "Leave it." Alara looked up, her own eyes filling with tears, not of pity, but of understanding. "It's a beautiful cradle," she said softly. "It shouldn't be covered in sorrow." "It's not yours to clean," he rasped, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was trembling. "You don't know. You don't know anything." He turned and fled, not stopping until he disappeared into the hills, leaving her alone with the ghosts she had tried to banish. She sat back on her heels, the wet rag dripping onto the floorboards, her heart aching for him, for the wife and child he had so clearly lost. She had not intruded on his home. She had intruded on his shrine. He didn't return until long after dark. She had left a plate of food for him on the table and retreated to the bed, feigning sleep. She heard him enter, the floorboards creaking. Under his heavy weight, he didn't eat. He walked to the cradle. In the faint moonlight filtering through the single window, she saw him trace the edge of it with one finger, the same spot she had been cleaning. His shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him, a man of iron forged in grief, finally melting in the heat of his own memory. She lay perfectly still, her own tears slipping silently onto the rough pillow, granting him the privacy of his heartbreak. It was a turning point. The wall of his grief was no longer impenetrable. She had seen through the cracks. The next morning, the tension was a physical thing in the small cabin. He avoided her eyes, his face grim, and shuddered. He was preparing to ride out, saddling his horse with sharp, angry movements. Alara watched him from the doorway, her heart in her throat. This was it. He was going to tell her to leave. He couldn't bear her presence, this living, breathing reminder of the family he didn't have. She took a deep breath, her own pride warring with her fear. "Caleb," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He stopped, his back still to her. "If you want me to go, I will. I won't be a burden." He turned slowly, his face etched with exhaustion. "Where would you go?" It was a genuine question, devoid of accusation. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I won't stay where I'm not wanted." He looked at the ground, at the sky, anywhere but at her. "It's not you," he finally managed to say, the words clumsy and painful for him. "The fire, it took everything. My wife, Sarah, my boy, Daniel." He finally met her gaze, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Cleaning the cradle. It was like you were trying to erase them." "No," she whispered, stepping toward him. "Never. It was because a child is coming. And a child deserves a beautiful place to sleep. It was for the future, not to erase the past." A single tear escaped his control, tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stood there, letting her see him, letting her witness his pain. It was a surrender, an offering. In that moment, the silence between them shifted. It was no longer a space of awkwardness and unspoken grief, but a shared territory, a quiet understanding of loss. He didn't ride out that day. Instead, he took an axe and went to the woodpile, splitting logs with a ferocious energy that lasted for hours. When he was done, he came back to the cabin, his shirt soaked with sweat, his breathing heavy. He walked over to the cradle, picked it up, and carried it outside into the sun. He took a piece of sandpaper from a toolbox and began to sand it down, his movements slow and methodical, stripping away the soot and scorch marks to reveal the pale, beautiful wood beneath. He was not erasing his son. He was preparing a space for hers. Alara watched him from the doorway, a small fragile seed of hope beginning to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. This was not love, not yet. It was something far more primal and necessary. It was the clumsy, painful, beautiful process of two broken people learning to build something new from the wreckage of their lives. The trip to town was a necessity they had postponed for as long as possible. Their supplies were dwindling to dust and dregs, and with the baby due in a matter of weeks, Caleb knew they needed things he couldn't hunt or grow. The journey was tense. Ilara sat on the wagon bench beside him, a world away from the huddled, unconscious woman he had transported weeks ago. She wore a simple dress she had sewn from some old flour sacks, her belly a proud round globe beneath the rough fabric. Her quiet dignity was a shield. As they rolled down the main street of Redemption Gulch, the town reacted as if they were a traveling freak show. Windows were peeked through. Conversations on the boardwalk stuttered to a halt. Whispers followed them like flies. There they are. Look at her, brazen as you please. Her he just took her. No preacher, no nothing. Bought himself a broodmare, is what I heard. Mrs. Gable stood on the porch of her mercantile, her arms crossed, her face a mask of sour judgment. As Caleb helped Ilara down from the wagon, his hand lingering on her arm a moment longer than necessary, Mrs. Gable's voice cut through the air. Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. And it looks like the cat's been busy. Caleb's body went rigid. He took a step toward her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But Ilara put a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly firm. It's all right, Caleb, she said, her voice clear and steady, loud enough for those nearby to hear. She looked directly at Mrs. Gable, her eyes holding no fear, only a calm, unwavering strength. We've come for supplies, Mrs. Gable. Not for your opinion. Though I thank you for offering it so freely. A few of the men loitering nearby chuckled. Mrs. Gable's face flushed with anger. Ilara walked past her into the store, her back straight, her head held high. Caleb followed, a look of stunned admiration on his face. He had been ready to fight for her honor, but she had defended it herself, with a grace and power that a fistfight never could. Inside, the chill was palpable. People moved away from them, creating a small, empty circle of judgment around them. Caleb handed a list to Mr. Gable, a mousy man who lived in his wife's shadow. As he gathered their flour, sugar, and salt, Ilara moved through the small store. She stopped at the display of fabrics, her hand gently touching a bolt of soft, yellow flannel. It was a foolish luxury, but she imagined her baby wrapped in its softness, and a deep maternal longing ached within her. Just then, another woman entered the store, Martha, the blacksmith's wife. She was a large, kind-faced woman whose husband had always offered Thomas a fair price and a sad smile. Martha saw Ilara, saw the longing in her eyes as she touched the flannel. She walked over, ignoring the disapproving glare of Mrs. Gable. That's a lovely color, Martha said, her voice warm. It would make a fine swaddling blanket. She looked at Ilara's belly, her eyes crinkling in a genuine smile. When are you due? Ilara was so taken aback by the simple kindness that she couldn't speak for a moment. A few weeks, I think, she managed to say. The first one is always a guess, Martha said knowingly. She picked up the bolt of flannel. Henry, she called to Mr. Gable, add 2 yards of this to my account. Before Ilara could protest, Martha pressed the fabric into her hands. Every child deserves something soft to welcome them into the world, she whispered, her eyes meeting Ilara's. It was a small act, but in the face of the town's collective hostility, it felt monumental. It was a hand reaching across a divide, a recognition of her not as a scandal, but as a mother. As they left the store, their supplies loaded, the mood on the street had subtly shifted. The blacksmith, a giant of a man with soot permanently etched into his skin, was standing outside his forge. He caught Caleb's eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a sign of respect, an acknowledgement. Others saw it. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but they were laced with a new thread of uncertainty. The town had passed its judgment, but Alara and Caleb were refusing to be broken by it. Their quiet resilience, her unyielding dignity, his protective presence, it was a story unfolding before their eyes, and it wasn't the sordid tale they had imagined. It was something else, something stronger. On their way out of town, they passed Sheriff Thorne's office. He was standing outside, polishing his badge, his eyes cold and calculating. He watched them go, a sneer on his lips. He was a man who fed on the weakness of others, and he could see that these two together were becoming strong. It was a strength he could not tolerate. It was a challenge to his authority, to the cruel order he maintained. As the wagon disappeared in a cloud of dust, he pinned the badge back on his chest. His gaze was fixed on the horizon where they had vanished. He knew about Thomas's debts, not just to the store, but to the county for land fees. A debt that could be collected. A debt that could give him leverage. He wasn't just watching them anymore. He was hunting. The quiet defiance had turned whispers into respect for some, but for Thorne, it had solidified into a dangerous, simmering rage. The final test was coming, not in the form of gossip, but in the cold, hard language of the law. The first snows came early that year, a fine, white powder dusting the purple peaks of the mountains and laying a thin crystalline blanket over the sagebrush. The world grew quiet, muffled. Inside the small cabin, a fragile warmth had taken root. Caleb had moved the newly sanded cradle next to the hearth, its pale wood glowing in the firelight. He had, without a word, given her his bed permanently, fashioning a comfortable pallet for himself on the floor. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of grief, but a comfortable space of shared existence. They spoke more now not of the past, but of the present and the immediate future. The dwindling woodpile, the strength of the patched roof, the best way to cook the tough winter squash from her little garden. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, rattling the windows and piling drifts against the door, the first true pain seized Alara. It was not the cramping fear of the collapse in town, but a deep, primal, rolling wave that took her breath away. She gasped, her hands flying to her belly. Caleb was by her side in an instant, his face a mask of concern in the flickering firelight. "It's time," she breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce, unyielding resolve. Panic flashed in Caleb's eyes, raw and unguarded. "The storm, the doctor, I can't." He looked around the cabin as if the walls were closing in, the ghosts of his past rushing toward him. He was seeing another birth, another life in his hands. "Caleb," Alara said, her voice sharp, cutting through his fear. She reached out and grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Look at me." He met her gaze, and in her eyes, he saw not a helpless victim, but a warrior. "You will not leave me. We will do this together." Her strength anchored him. He took a deep breath, the panic receding, replaced by a grim focus. He was a rancher. He had helped birth calves' foals, lambs. He knew life was a messy, bloody, brutal business. He nodded, his jaw set. "Together," he affirmed. He spent the next hours boiling water, tearing strips from clean flour sacks, his movements efficient and sure. He held her hand through every wave of pain, whispering words of encouragement, his voice a low, steady rumble against the howl of the wind. He was no longer the haunted widower. He was a man fighting for the new life in his home. After a long, harrowing night, a new sound joined the chorus of the storm, the thin, reedy cry of a healthy baby boy. Caleb, his hands shaking, wrapped the slick, squirming infant in the soft, yellow flannel Martha had given them and placed him in Alara's waiting arms. Tears streamed down Alara's face as she looked at her son, his tiny face wrinkled and perfect. She looked up at Caleb, his face streaked with sweat and tears of his own. "His name," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "is Daniel." Caleb staggered back as if struck. "No," he choked out. "You can't." "Yes," she insisted softly, her gaze unwavering. "His name is Daniel Thomas. For both the fathers he will know. The one who gave him life and the one who saved it." In that moment, the last of the walls around Caleb's heart crumbled into dust. He knelt by the bed, his head bowed, and wept not for the son he had lost, but for the son he had gained. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the baby's cheek, a connection forged in storm and sorrow, a family born not of blood or law, but of brutal, beautiful choice. The blizzard passed, leaving the world pristine and silent under a bright winter sun, but their peace was short-lived. A week later, a rider appeared, his horse struggling through the deep snow. It was Sheriff Thorne. He didn't dismount. He unrolled a scroll of paper, his voice booming with sanctimonious authority in the clean, cold air. "By the authority of Redemption County," he declared, his eyes glinting with malicious triumph, "I have here a lien against the property and issue of the deceased Thomas Miller for failure to pay outstanding debts and land fees to the county." He smirked, his gaze falling on the cabin door where Alara stood, holding her baby, Caleb a protective wall beside her. "The law is clear. A child born into debt is a ward of the county until that debt is settled. I'm here to collect the boy." Rage, pure and white-hot, surged through Caleb. "You'll do no such thing," he snarled, taking a step forward. Thorne's hand went to the pistol at his hip. "Resisting a lawful order is a crime, Caleb. I've got 2 deputies just over that rise. Don't be a fool. The child belongs to the town now. He'll be raised in the workhouse properly. You will not take my son." Ilara's voice rang out, clear and cold as the winter air. She held Daniel tighter, her body a shield. "It's not your choice," Thorne sneered. "It's the law." He looked past them, at the small, scarred cabin. The meager ranch. Unless, of course, the debt can be paid in full. $200 by noon tomorrow. He knew it was an impossible sum. He laughed, a short, ugly sound, and wheeled his horse around. "Noon tomorrow, at the courthouse steps. Be there, or I'll come back with my deputies and take what's mine." He rode off, leaving them in a silence more profound and terrifying than the blizzard. The sum was a death sentence. Caleb had a few dollars saved, nothing more. They were trapped. That night, the cabin was filled with a new kind of silence, the silence of despair. Ilara rocked her baby, her face pale but her eyes burning with a fierce, defiant fire. Caleb paced the floor, his mind racing, searching for a way out where there was none. He could fight, but he would lose. They would kill him and take the boy anyway. "There's one thing," he said, his voice rough. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his face a canvas of anguish. "My wife, Sarah. She had jewelry. Her mother's. It's not much, but it might be enough. I buried it with her." The words were torn from his very soul. To dig up his wife's grave, to disturb her final peace, was a desecration he could barely contemplate. It was trading one ghost for another. Ilara stood up and walked to him, placing a hand on his chest. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a love that had grown silently, nurtured in the shared soil of their brokenness. "No," she said firmly. "We will not desecrate the past to save the future. We will stand together. We will go to that courthouse, and we will face him." The next morning, they rode into town. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The entire town of Redemption Gulch was gathered in front of the courthouse, a grim gallery awaiting the final act of their drama. Sheriff Thorne stood on the steps, puffed up with his own power. Caleb helped Ilara down from the wagon. She held Daniel, wrapped snugly in his yellow blanket, against her chest. They walked through the silent crowd, their heads held high, and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "It's noon," Thorn declared. "Do you have the money?" "No," Caleb said, his voice steady. "We have something more." He looked not at Thorn, but at the faces in the crowd, the gossips, the doubters, the few who had shown them kindness. "You all know me. You know I lost my family. This ranch, this life, it was a tomb. I was a dead man walking." His voice cracked, but he pushed on. "Then she came, this woman. You cast her out. You shamed her. But she carried on, with a strength I have never known. And this boy," he looked at the bundle in Alara's arms, "this boy is not a debt, he is a promise. He's the first thing that has made me want to live since the fire." He turned back to Thorn. "You want to take him? You want to put him in your cold, loveless workhouse? You'll have to kill me first." "The law is the law," Thorn bellowed, his face turning purple. "Your law is cruel and unjust." A voice boomed from the crowd. It was the blacksmith. He pushed his way to the front, his wife Martha beside him. "This isn't about debt. This is about decency. We've watched them. We've seen them build a life from ashes. That's more than most of us can say." Martha stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You want to orphan a child who has a loving mother and a man who would die for him? For money? What kind of town have we become?" A murmur went through the crowd. Faces that had been hard with judgment began to soften with shame. Mrs. Gable, for the first time, looked uncertain. The doctor stepped forward. "I'll put in $20 against that debt," he said loudly. "And I'll put in 10. The blacksmith roared. One by one, others stepped forward. A farmer offered $5. A saloon girl, her face painted but her eyes sincere, offered 2. Small, pathetic amounts on their own, but together they were a revolution. They were not just offering money. They were casting a vote. They were choosing the family they had once scorned over the sheriff who claimed to represent them. Thorn watched, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, as a small pile of coins and crumpled bills grew at Caleb and Alara's feet. It wasn't enough, not even close to $200, but it was everything. It was the town's redemption. Alara, tears streaming down her face, looked at the people before her. She stepped forward, her voice ringing with a power they had never heard. "Keep your money," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "Your support is the only payment we need." She looked directly at Thorn, her eyes like chips of flint. "This is our son. This is our home. This is our family. And there is no law on God's green earth that is stronger than that." She and Caleb turned, not waiting for Thorn's dismissal, and walked back to their wagon. The crowd parted for them, their silence no longer one of judgment, but of awe. As Caleb helped her into the wagon, he took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. He looked at her, at the fierce, beautiful, unbreakable woman who had saved him from his own ghosts and at the son she had given them. They drove out of town, leaving Sheriff Thorn alone on the steps, his authority shattered, his power rendered meaningless. They didn't look back. They rode toward the snow-covered hills, toward their small, scarred cabin that had become a home. Later that week, beneath a vast, silent sky, with the blacksmith and his wife as their only witnesses, Caleb placed a simple, hand-carved wooden ring on Alara's finger. It wasn't a beginning, but a recognition of what already was. Their home was filled with the scent of baking bread, the sound of a baby's laughter, and the quiet, steady rhythm of 2 hearts beating as one. The scars were still there, on the walls of the cabin and in the depths of their souls, but they were no longer signs of what was lost. They were the beautiful, jagged lines that proved they had survived. They were 2 broken halves who had found. In the heart of the unforgiving frontier, that family was not a thing you were given, but a thing you fought for, a thing you built, a thing you healed with.